Hey, Bernardo.
Hi, we're live now?
We're live now, I promise.
Great. Okay.
Welcome. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Thanks for joining us today.
I've been looking forward to it. You are one of my favorite friends to talk to on the webcams.
Thank you. I mean, we should probably clarify for people that most of the conversations we've ever had have happened over webcam.
Yeah.
How many words do you think we've spoken to each other in person? Like 9?
Probably 43.
Best guess.
Yeah, because 9 would have been a trivial and forgetful exchange. 43 at least lends some room for um for some kind of memory and progress and a way to connect later on at least.
Yeah, see, I don't have any positive memories associated with speaking to you in person. No offense. That has nothing to do with you. It's just that like the first time we met, you came over and like I was introduced to you, and then you sort of immediately started talking. This is my mom. I'm sorry. You immediately started talking to the person next to me, and I was like, "That's fine," because you both were speaking Spanish, and I was like, I should shut up, and so I just sort of sat there, and I was like, "Wow, I have no idea what they're talking about," and then and I was like, "But that's fine." And then the second time we met, I wanted to get your email address because I had a bunch of questions. Oh my God, he's already taking notes. See, you just caused me so much anxiety. The second time that we met was a year later. It was at the same conference, but it was a year later. And I wanted to get your email address. And I was so nervous to ask that I came up to you and I like had my pen and paper ready because I wanted to take up so little of your time. And I like dropped the pen on your foot. Like that was it. That was my moment in the sunshine. Is I dropped the pen on you. And then I don't even remember if I asked. I think I just kind of put the items in your hands because I was too embarrassed by that point. And I was like, just do the thing where you write down the info that I can contact you with later, so I can hide behind the wall of ones and zeros when the next time we talk. It can all be digital. But
The wall of ones and zeros.
yeah, I mean that's binary code, right? Hold on one second.
It is, yeah.
This way.
I'm putting my phone on do not disturb.
We lost you. Oh,
yeah.
There you are.
Yeah.
This is a terrible way of introducing you, but to be fair, I knew that introducing you was going to be a nightmare, so I guess we might as well start at the low point and like work our way up. Lovely listeners, thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm really, really excited to be interviewing this person, despite the fact that he's causing me to sweat profusely. This is Bernardo Mazandaher, and he is an everything. He's an artist and an activist. He's a colleague and dear friend. He's worked as a dramaturg, as an actor. He's an acting teacher. He's been a community organizer. Anything cool and like artistic and world savvy that you can imagine, I promise you he's at least touched on it at some point in his short life. And we're very, very lucky to have him on our show today. He is someone that I am deeply inspired by and profoundly moved by, and so I can't wait to talk to him about the work that he does, and sort of where he sees our industry going and where he sees sort of the wheels of justice turning. This is going to be a really fun conversation, so thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me and for making the space.
So I should probably go back and like re-explain how we met, because I feel like I just did a terrible job, but it is useful in sort of getting to the heart of some of the art that you have made, and your perhaps identity as an artist. So the conference that I'm referring to is the LMDA conference. That's the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. I went to my first one after I graduated from undergrad, which was the summer. It was June of 2017. And that was when we first met. I don't know, was that your first one? It didn't seem like it.
Yeah.
It was. See, whatever. I sort of I remember seeing him on the first day of the conference and being like, oh, that's someone who like really gets it. Like he had like queues of people lining up to talk to him, and like he was just so at ease, and I was like a bundle of nerves, and I was like, oh man, I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I'm going to embarrass myself in front of a dramaturg I've never like heard of. It's just like possibly the worst moment of our relationship was when I found out we were the same age. I was like, that's not fair. You need to have like 3 or 4 years on me for me to be okay with how much you've accomplished. But that was our first time. That was our first time meeting. And then we went to that was in Oakland. Was that year? Oakland, California.
Berkeley.
Berkeley. Yeah. And then the year after, we met in Toronto, Canada, because it's of the Americas, and so the conference had gone up to Canada, and so talking about the other corner of our continent, and that was when I found out that he had been working as a resident in the Dramaturgy department of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, which I've talked on this show about many times. It's a really important place for me as an artist, and formative for me as a Shakespearean. It shaped who I am and how I am today. And so when I found out that he had worked there, and that he was, sort of my age, and had my interest in dramaturgy, I wanted to hear all about it. And so I asked for his email, hoping that he and I could set up like an email correspondence. And the first thing that he said when I sent him my first email after that conference is he was like, "Let's have a phone call. Like, let's not do this in email." So blew through my entire plan of hiding behind, editing. Because when I write, I can sound a lot better than I do in person. And you sort of robbed me of that. And you forced me to talk on the fly, which is how we get all of this. And so we had a phone call. I think I had marked out a half an hour, 20 minutes, a half an hour on my schedule. I was like, this shouldn't take too long. He's not going to want to talk to me for long. I just want to get a sense of what OSF was like. And we talked for, what was it, 2 hours? 2.5 hours? I don't know.
Something
I remember it was dinner time, and my mom was like, "Are you still on the phone?" So that was kind of the rest. The rest is history, because when you talk to an artist that you feel like you can never talk to enough, I feel like that's when you know that you've met someone you need to keep coming back to. And so at least that was how I felt. And so I went to England, and then I went to New York, and we just sort of kept in touch via email, basically. The next time we spoke in person was a year and a half later, and it was totally not related to the arts. And then this spring, we finally got to actually make some art together. And we don't have to talk about it much, but it was the coolest thing that ever happened for me. And so I'm going to mention it now. I wrote a 2-play stage adaptation of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, and asked Bernardo to read for one of the leads, to read for Andrei Bolkonsky, which he graciously did, despite the fact that he has a tempestuous relationship, let us say, with the classics. He made an exception, and bless him forever, because he did a beautiful job. And then we got to workshop the plays together for about 3 weeks, which was just beautiful and extraordinary and life-changing. So that was how I got to know him more as an actor. And it was also how I sort of got to know how his dramaturgical brain works. And so I think my first question for you is how did you find your way into dramaturgy specifically? And why is dramaturgy where you sort of find joy and resonance as an artist?
It's very funny to me that that your first memory of us is at that dramaturgy conference in Berkeley in 2017. I had barely been speaking the word and language of dramaturgy for a few months. And when I applied to that literary residency at OSF the December prior, I remember feeling like such a hack and such a fraud, because I had a few dramaturgy credits on my resume. But to be honest, at the time, none of them were really they were really full-time experiences, or even really professional. I did a professional one. I got a regional theater and didn't get paid for it, which is very typical at that company, and obviously typical in the field.
Yeah.
So I guess it's amusing to me that I have that profile now. There were 2 instructors at my university who taught dramaturgy, but at the graduate level. Mm-hmm. And when they introduced dramaturgical concepts for undergraduates, I paid very little attention. To be honest, I can't say at all that I was a lazy student. I wasn't. I was actually probably the opposite, and more on that side of rigorous and and determined, but I often didn't stay for the entire theater history classes because I was going to go to some community meeting or some rehearsal,
Yeah.
Or just something that I thought this is going to be a better use of my time, and I can read about this later. On top of the kind of C's get degrees culture that my university presented me with. Mm. So, I feel like I thoroughly avoided dramaturgy for a long time when it was the perfect convergence of the two things I was studying, literature and theater.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't until that residency at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival where I found not only like the infinitely wide continuum of how dramaturgy works, what it looks like, what it sounds like,
yeah,
and the kind of works I want to associate myself with, and what kind of roles I ought to play. So yeah, I feel like I owe them so much of my awakening.
That's awesome. And which shows did you work on at OSF?
I worked on the Merry Wives of Windsor, Henry IV Part 2, and an adaptation of Measure for Measure called Off the Rails by Andy Reynolds.
Yeah. And for those of our listeners who just like can't get enough of me, earlier today in our Enneagram Shakespeare series where we type Shakespeare characters as the Enneagram, we did 8, which is my type. And I babbled at great length about Prince Hal from the Henry IV's and 5 play. And I can't really express to you listeners how much it rocked my world when I found out that I was talking to someone who had worked on one of those shows that had like actually changed my life. And like to this day, I just, it's not envy. Envy's the wrong word for it, but I'm so in awe of the fact that like you were in that room, that you were with those people in that room, because I dream about that. Like it was, I came away from those plays and I was like, if I could turn back time, if I had like a time turner from Harry Potter, I would be so irresponsible with it because I would just use it to like go back to the first day of rehearsal for part 1, and I would just like sit in a corner in the background and just watch like a fly on the wall. That would make me happy. That would be enough. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a really, it's a pretty prestigious place to get your launch. But at the same time, like it only takes talking to you for a little while, I think, to understand like why they wanted you as part of that conversation during that sort of like formative time. Do you find that dramaturgy is the role in theater making that you're sort of naturally most drawn to? Or is it kind of, I don't know, is it kind of on an even plane with acting?
I want to say the latter. But yeah, neither are really true.
Okay.
I'm so much more drawn to performance at a personal and spiritual level.
Okay.
Yeah, acting for me is a great lifelong passion, and alongside the teaching of acting.
Yep.
But really, dramaturgy for me is a form of service to either the development of the play or the access to the play or the follow-up of a performance.
Yeah.
It's a dramaturgy for me is the element of the theater process that makes the play matter and that makes the play effective.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, for me, acting would just be an indulgent and insular practice.
Yeah, and that's very valid. It's really hard to be friends with you sometimes.
Well,
because I enjoy making art, like, and I find that that's my best way of like moving the world forward and putting important messages into the world. And then at the same time, like, I guess I don't let myself think about whether it's indulgent or not to want to direct, or to want to write. It just feels, it feels as natural as breathing. It almost doesn't feel like a choice. I know that it is. But I always struggled with dramaturgy for the exact reason that I felt like I wanted to be creating more And it was so difficult for me to sit in the room with creators and to be like, oh man, that's not my job here. My job is not to be the innovator. My job is not to have the creative ideas per se. I mean, you have to be creative to be a dramaturg, but like it is, there's something less tactical about it. And I that's what I miss whenever I do dramaturgy. But at the same time, like I know from experience that, that dramaturgs, they not only champion the integrity of a piece of art, like they keep everyone focused on what really matters in the play and in the story. But at the same time, they're also they're advocating for like the purpose of the piece of art in the larger community, right, and in the larger social and political context. Like, is this play and is the way that we are telling this story doing anything to move us forward or to make us look at a social or cultural norm in a new way? And that work is so essential and it's so urgent. And so I have this simultaneous admiration of dramaturgs, and also I'm almost intimidated by them. And I think that reaches its apex with you. I'm incredibly intimidated by you, and that doesn't happen very often. But like, I think it's because you have that sense of service, and you're committed to it. And I really struggle to be committed to it. And so I think it like makes me feel so selfish or like self-conscious about being, about sort of being what I am and liking what I do. But it's interesting. Like I have this strange relationship with acting where like I really, really enjoy it. But I just find when I'm doing it, when I'm in the middle of it, like I want to be doing other things as well. Like it's hard for me to stay in the lane of one character. So dramaturgy and acting are the two that I'm like, how do I get satisfaction from this? I know that's not the point. Satisfaction is not the point, but I'm like, how do I find fulfillment in this? Whereas with playwriting and directing, it's just like, oh yeah, this is just what is. So do you have this might be an impossible question, but do you have a favorite or a few favorite projects that you've worked on in any capacity? It can be as a dramaturg or as something else, but like what productions that you have been involved with have like transformed you or made you into the artist that you sort of are today?
I'd love to answer that. Before I do, I just want to touch on something prior.
Mm-hmm.
For disclosure to the audience and listeners, I very much have this deeply entrenched mind frame around like work versus play. That I inherited from my family and my culture, and that is also synonymous with whatever that dichotomy between like self-care and like whatever makes one happy, versus community service or social service. And so
right.
Like that's something that I just don't know how to say this. Like this just came up to me. This came up in my mind as in our conversation. Even for me, reading is a privilege, and it's an indulgent hobby. But I
know.
You know what I mean? Like
yes.
Where at the same time, I was disciplined to think reading is that investment. It's the hard work. And I'm still reconciling that. Like, if I could, I would spend all day, 6 days of the week reading.
I know.
And now I'm still kind of letting go of that reality. And for me, that's synonymous with acting. Like, sure. Now that I've really figured out of the value of exercising one's emotional range and problem solving in simulant through scene work. Yeah, I've hit that constant reminder that I would love to make art all the time, but it's just not enough for me. Although, and this is back to that disclosure for our audiences, we talk about this all the time, and I'm always ready to celebrate and praise people who are just making art all the time, because our world needs those people, and they deserve to do that.
Yeah, I had a bit of an existential crisis the first time we really talked on the phone, because I remember you said something similar to what you've just told me right now about feeling the indulgence, feeling like acting was indulgent. And that for me, I was like, what? Because even there's the thought of making art as being self-indulgent. Like for me, that was so, it was so terrifying, because then I was like, oh my God, then what is like, what about, have I been wasting my life? Have I not been, have I been too insular and too selfish in the way that I've moved through the world? And I still feel that way constantly, and I'm constantly sort of trying to figure out ways that I can integrate my politics and my sense of justice into the stories that I tell, especially by re-examining and kind of imagining classical stories. I love cracking open narratives that have been that we have received in the Western tradition and interrogating them, and then kind of like re-Legoing them, right? Like if they're made up of Lego pieces and we get them in this shape, I like taking the Lego pieces and being like, okay, so how could I like use these same pieces, these same building blocks, and like restructure them in such a way that like instead of a starship of death, right? I have like, I don't know, like something that gives life, or something that is positive, like I don't know, like a ship that like takes medical supplies to people. But I like to see how the pieces that make up our mythic tales can be repurposed to shine a light on the injustices of our world today. But even so, like in being friends with you and in sort of the course of knowing you for a couple of years now, and seeing your work in the community as a campaign organizer, and your connection with like EMT work and now the law. Really, listeners, like I can't overemphasize how many pies this guy has his fingers in. I have realized that like you're taking that, I think, idea that I had, and you're like activating it out in the real world, and I find that so inspiring, and so I want to make sure that we talk about it, because I know it's as formative, if not more so, for you than art. So, can you talk a little bit about your community organizing?
I'd love to. I know there was another question you asked earlier that I didn't get to.
We can talk about productions that have changed your life anytime. For right now, you can talk about community organizing.
I don't have a website.
Neither do I.
I will soon, because I recognize the power in that. But I feel like I have to give a shout out to all the artists and organizers that are out there who, in some way, are really making like a demonstrable impact, a recording impact. Because I'm still at a phase in my development where my life has been very much breadth and not depth. And I can see myself transitioning into that soon as I start another organization, or as I get my graduate degree, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But all those people have a masterful way of diverting attention away from themselves. It's intrinsic to the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
And so there's that harmony of like, we have to celebrate and highlight artists, and there's also so many of us who counteract that with bringing our focus back towards the issues that are really mattering.
Yeah.
So your question to me was around community organizing, is that right?
Yeah, talk us through your work in that.
So about a year ago, just about a year ago, I started a fellowship with an organization called the Organizing and Leadership Academy. And what it was a program where like half the day would be spent going over curriculum and strategies, the methodology of grassroots organizing. Mm-hmm. and really all of the branches of that, whether that's union organizing or faith-based organizing, or campaign organizing, but with grassroots kind of being in the center. The latter half of the day was spent actually putting those ideas into practice. I realized really quickly that I had been applying those ideas and those skills in the theater world for innovation and reform within that sector. Or in the forms of audience development. But I started accruing this lexicon of organizing in the broader sense for issues outside of the artistic world. And so I've been pretty high off that sense. I remember that was a 4-month contract, and I was playwriting in the evenings and dramaturging on the weekends, and like in between breaks answering emails for my organization. But for all intents and purposes, I was not working on production, and it was the first time I had that kind of break since I discovered theater in my late teens, and it felt great. I was so happy. Coming back to San Diego after, I was very happy to work on a show again, with a cast of like 25, the majority of whom have not been on stage before. And I made a purpose of interweaving those two identities of mine. And I think I'm still on that pathway. I'm very much on a research binge around what legislative theater is. And so odds are I might look back on this interview a couple months or years from now going, oh yeah, like I was just about to start this thing, and now here it is. I hope I don't look back on it as just as an entertaining thought or whim, but I can very much, I feel very deeply that this is what all of my training and professional development, research and exploration is leading up to.
What is legislative theater?
Legislative theater is it's simulating scenes or stories based around an issue of injustice or a legislation that is in consideration of change, and incorporating the audience, community members, we call them spect actors, in tribute to Augusto Boal's terminology, the spectator and actor, simultaneously. The audience participates in the rewriting of the story. For example, intervening, or how a person might respond differently against an injustice or a form of oppression. How a person might advocate for a victim in a scenario. So it's a way of bringing people together so that they can collectively envision what a policy ought to look like and practice advocating for it.
Very cool. So how did you first hear about it or encounter it?
I can't remember. Feud of the Oppressed.
That's no use to me.
Yeah, I honestly can't remember. It just kind of it's like you've been looking at the constellations in the night sky for a long, long time, and then finally you notice that there's been a star there the whole time, but there wasn't a word for it. I think it might have started off of Theater of the Oppressed New York's website.
Yeah.
Where Theater of the Oppressed had been, the methodologies had been familiar to me for a few years. I did not learn about them in college, and I don't know if that was either just the priorities of my institution or my consistent leaving my theater history classes early. But I didn't really land on Theater of the Oppressed until 2 years ago when I saw my first forum play. And I started realizing how some of the people I admired in the field who had uh, who were very prominently active and vocal about either civic engagement or issues of injustice,
Yeah.
mainly outside of San Diego, working in the theater. They also had track records or positionalities around creating theater of the oppressed. And so I guess it was when I started falling down that rabbit hole that I saw legislative theater in that repertoire. And I'm still there. I'm seeing it's not really the center of the conversation around theater of the oppressed, which fascinates me. And I have a strong feeling that it's about to enter the zeitgeist.
Yeah, you're probably right. Well, I just want to take a moment, since we're about at the halfway point, and just say a brief thank you to our sponsors and all of the people who've enabled us to do this today. So yeah, thank you so much to the Arts Council of Fayetteville and Cumberland County for supporting the arts and specifically for supporting Sweet Tea, especially during this incredibly difficult time of COVID-19. Thank you for endowing us with the resources that have allowed us to continue to connect with artists and practice a new sort of digital stagecraft during this time of lockdown. We're so grateful. And it enables me to have wonderful conversations like this with amazing artists like Bernardo. So thank you for all that you do for us and just for investing in the artistic community of North Carolina. And then personally, I just want to do a quick shout out to the artistic director, Jeremy Feebig, and our incredible general manager, Ashanti Bennett. They do more in less time than I can possibly express or even really fathom. Thank you so much for taking a chance on me and for continuing to invest in me. Could never do any of this without you. So thank you very much. So, all right. I feel like there's so many thousand things we could talk about, but for the sake of consistency, I would love it if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the productions that have molded you and moved you. Whatever, and like if you could describe the sort of the role that you played in that production. Yeah, would love to hear how you got to where you are.
Sure. The most immediate one that comes to mind is a production I did. It was the first one I did when I graduated college. I was working on a few others at the same time, but this was the one that most consumed my time. It was a piece called Instrumental Journey that I devised with folks from Germany and Australia, but mainly written by a friend of mine named Rick Okipa. I did not know him until December 2016 actually. This was a piece for young audiences commissioned by a local music organization here in San Diego, and it was telling the stories of how people have migrated and refugees seek asylum around the world, alongside histories of how musical instruments have migrated and evolved and reintegrated across cultures. Cool. So paralleling immigration with ethnomusicology.
Yeah.
For me, aesthetically, those were two things that I was fascinated by. In terms of impact, we delivered it for free to dozens of elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, K through 12, all over the county. And it was the first time I wore multiple hats in a production. And I don't want to do that again, but
it was a great experience. It was a one-off, but it was a great experience.
I've done it many times.
Yeah, I know you have.
But I was one of the developers. I was essentially a lead performer. We were a cast of 3, but I played the facilitator, the narrator, as you could say, and I was also, my character was a DJ in the play, so I was literally
incredible,
like pressing all the buttons and cues live on stage.
Sure, nice metaphor.
So yeah, it was a great artistic fruition of everything I learned to do at the time.
Awesome.
And to this day, I look at that script and its template for community interaction, because that's what it's based off of. And I'm so proud. I think it really stands for what I like and what I feel like people need to see.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. That's one. Actually, 2 years later, I worked with that same writer again, Rick.
No way.
I loved
didn't know
his.
that.
Yeah. We created a piece. It was basically autobiographical to him, called the Fanyata, about a nonviolent, reusable community building evolution of the piñata. And I'd say it was widely intersectional in terms of Rick's identities. It was deeply illuminating for the history of how the piñata came to the Western world.
Yeah.
And again, it was embracing my multi-hyphenism of being a director and dramaturg and producer. I played all those roles in helping make this piece. I'm hoping one day that it becomes a TED Talk.
Oh, cool.
In that form. I'd say those two were probably some of my favorite experiences.
Awesome.
As a theater maker.
Oh, I hope you do a TED Talk someday. In fact, I remember the first time we chatted on the phone, whatever, like June of 2018, I was like, I don't think I asked you, but I felt certain as we were talking, I was like, surely he has a TED Talk somewhere. And I looked it up. You didn't. But I was like, I bet. Of all the people I've ever met who like would probably have TED Talks, I assumed that you would be one of them. So it doesn't surprise me that you've considered sort of taking it to that next level of investigation and visibility.
Yeah, I float TED Talks in my mind all the time, of things to talk about and how to talk about them.
Sure.
And yet at the same time, in my more recent life, I've become of the opinion that I don't need to talk for a half hour or an hour in front of an audience. I'd rather get people to talk to each other, or share the space with a collective of folks. So yeah, TED Talks on the horizon. Definitely coaching people so that they can present themselves is a dream of mine. But we'll see. Time will tell.
Yeah, there's a line in a play that I'm working on right now, and I wrote it without thinking about it, and then I like looked back on it later, and I was like, oh man, I wrote that line because of Bernardo, and the line is, "Men like you are exhausting." And I just return to that in my head almost all the time. Whenever we're talking, I'm like, oh man, yeah, men like you are exhausting. In a good way, but like, God. It's fine.
When you say men, do you mean like people of maleness or?
Yes.
Or people of men? Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's very specific. So, all right, so you had mentioned coaching people, and I think that's a really... I would think it's a useful segue to talking about your teaching, because I haven't really touched on it. But for the past semester, you have been an acting teacher for high school students, and high school students who are specifically interested in the arts, right? Like in theater. And I'd love to hear you chat about that, and possibly about sort of how it changed because of coronavirus.
So the School of Creative and Performing Arts in San Diego is a county magnet public arts school. And I started teaching essentially the same day that they announced the lockdown.
That's right.
So I showed up to school, and I was prepared with like a half-baked speech for all my students. They had been anticipating me for a long time. Just because of hiring for that school in particular, they didn't have a consistent and stable and equipped acting teacher all year. And then that happened. So it was a great cosmic joke, for a dream that I had been preparing for many years.
Yeah.
And then we reverted to teaching online. And I ended up playing a very different role in terms of being an anchor for the students who were losing passion and losing faith in the career they were choosing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard to say, look at what's happening in the world right now. Look at where you could go when the world is shut down, and the craft that they're interested in pursuing is like actually against the law. I mean, it's such a difficult. It was a difficult psychological phenomenon for me to integrate into like my psyche, and I'm not even in school anymore. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for these young people who are beginning to define themselves as artists, and developing this growing passion for the craft of theater, and realizing like, oh man, wow, this art can do and say so much. Like the capacity of this art form is beyond anything I could have imagined. And for that like burgeoning amazement and optimism, for it to be like sprayed with like the toxic mist of like a pandemic, like it's so hard. And I had forgotten that your first day was supposed to be lockdown day. I remember that they were close to each other. I didn't realize that it all happened at once. But what I mean, you now haven't really gotten to teach acting the proper way, which is in person with your students, with a relationship created between you and them that is authentic. But even so, like what draws you to teaching, and what was, if anything, was fulfilling about teaching them about the craft of acting, even though it had to happen digitally?
Oh man, where to begin? I feel like I could answer your question, what draws me to teaching?
Mm-hmm.
Separate question as to what draws me to teaching acting.
Yeah, sure.
The former being because I can't call myself a good student at the age of 14. I was not focused. And I wasn't motivated. I was great at school, and I was very privileged to have access. But even then, at the time, I didn't know that I had it. I didn't really activate myself as a student until my late teens. Particularly when I discovered literature and theater, forms for me to towards self-actualization. And then there's why I love teaching acting. For both of those questions, I feel like we just have so many bad teachers.
No, that's valid.
Yeah, our culture is plagued with bad teachers. And I know I'm not a perfect teacher either, but one of the essential ingredients for an effective teacher is a teacher who keeps a thorough pulse on what's being effective in the classroom, rather than pressing autopilot to how they've been teaching across the years, what they've been teaching.
Yeah.
Maybe it's my newness in my youth as an educator that makes me so impassioned about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone to an EMP academy. I did an organizing academy. I just finished real estate school on top of like my 2 BAs, and I've experienced so many different kinds of teachers, and I just don't think we talk enough about what's effective and what's worthwhile. Since like as all the platitudes say, the children are the world, they're the future, and yet the United States education system is notoriously poor.
Yeah.
Compared to so many other cultures.
Yep.
With regards to teaching acting, it all stems back to the moment where I clocked acting as a lifelong focus for me. I was in an intermediate acting class. I had just registered for the theater minor before I did the major, just so that I could take this class because I had heard so many great things about this teacher.
Wow, we in that respect we're exactly the same then, because I declared a theater minor so I could take an acting class.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
And then it became a major.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that could be its own article on HowlRound, and then it became a major, you know?
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
Something to think about.
Yeah.
So I took the class, and I was having a great time. I saw my relationships grow. I evolved a lot as a person just through the experience of taking an acting class, and it was obviously a lot of fun. But the memory that sticks with me the most from that class was actually watching someone else do a scene. Another couple doing a scene.
Yeah.
These two students were so wildly different.
Imagine that.
What's that?
I said, imagine that.
Yeah. Extremely different social locations in terms of like ethnicity and gender and ability and economic background. Regionally, I don't know where they were from, but I knew one of them wasn't from where I was from, and I noticed that even though there was a dichotomy in the class between students who had come to our school from out of town with resources and with a background in the arts and some determination, some bourgeois determination to become professional Broadway or Hollywood actors, commercial actors at that, alongside other people who were just kind of experimenting and exploring.
Yeah.
Had no background in the arts. I had a couple of years at that point, but not really to the degree of declaring this is for me. I saw both of these students do tremendously good work in the scene together, and they were both also very shy and afflicted by something. I mean, I can't go into what it was, but the point is, I saw them heal and grow as people on top of do very compelling work. Like, to me, it continues to be the best acting I ever saw, just in that one scene. And that happened constantly in that class.
Yeah.
I know now it happens in effective acting classes all over the world.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of good actor training.
Yeah.
But I remember knowing then and there, not only do I love doing this, I need to learn how to teach this, because that's some spiritual stuff right there. What's happening? Yeah. So that's a major chord in my life.
I love it. And I had a similar experience, not quite as earth shattering, but definitely revelatory. Because the acting course that I took my freshman year, I was moved into it. So I enrolled in the basic intro level acting class because I was like, I just want to do this. If it means I have to declare a theater minor, that's fine, but I just want to do this. Yeah. So I did it, and then after my first day, they moved me out of it, and they moved me into a class where I was with all juniors and seniors. And so I didn't know anybody. Like, I didn't know anybody in the freshman class either, but they were friends. They were faces that I knew from, like, being around campus during orientation. And now I was suddenly with juniors and seniors who just felt, like, so much older than me and so much, like, worldlier and wiser than me. And they were very welcoming. It's not that they treated me like an outcast, but I certainly felt like one. And I imposed alienation on myself because I was so intimidated by them. And I watched a scene between two young women, directed by our incredible acting teacher, Jess K. Smith. And it was the willow scene from Othello. And we were learning about, like, gestus, right? And, like, the single gesture that, like, you know, manifests a character's either innermost desire or their main conflict. but it's some gesture that like sums them up. And so we were learning about that concurrently to working on these Shakespeare scenes. And the girl who was playing Desdemona had started doing this thing kind of without realizing it. They decided to have Amelia brushing out her hair. And so Amelia was brushing one side of her hair, and then the actress Marika was just doing this, just like tugging on her hair while she explained the Willow story and started singing it. And you don't really think about it in the moment because you can tell that Desdemona's on edge, and it makes sense that she would be doing something kind of repetitively and almost obsessively or compulsively, right, in that state of anxiety. So all of us were sort of like, oh yeah, that's a gesture that makes sense for the character, and we didn't really realize that she was playing the long game, because in the moment when she finally sent Amelia away and Amelia left, she pulled her hands away and hair just fell out of her hands. She had been actually pulling her hair out to do the scene. And she had been bunching up hair in her hands. And when she like did this, it just sort of came like cascading into her lap. And then the scene ended, and I was like, and all of us in the room, like all of us that were seated, literally leaned back in our chairs, not only because that moment was so kind of visceral, but also because weirdly, we all suddenly felt like the door was going to open and Othello was going to come in. Like it was so strange that like the room, our white room with our black blocks and our very, academic environment suddenly just seemed to melt away. And we were right there with her in that bedroom in Cyprus. And we were like, when the door opened, it was just the actress playing Amelia coming back in. But when the door opened, we were all like, because it was like we all thought that Othello was going to come in. And then the scene ended, and our teacher was like, see, that's gestus, right? Like, and she was sort of like, she was kind of low key about it. She was like, yeah, that's a useful. And I remember sitting there like, oh my God, that was acting. Like I had lost track of that somewhere along the way, that what they were doing was acting. I was in the world with them. And it remains to this day, like just the best performance of that scene I've ever seen. I've seen Othello more times than I can count, but nothing ever will match the magic of that, because the two actresses were so invested in each other, as well as the scene, right? They were investing in each other, and that was part of the magic. And then they were invested in the scene, and the world just like melted away. And when you experience that, I don't know, it's, people talk about like the adrenaline high of acting, or like how theater can be a drug. And I think that's what they mean, is it's not necessarily like you feel like you're hallucinating, but you definitely feel like you've entered another dimension where what is real about our world is just kind of irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, it's totally amazing. So yeah, that's very, very cool.
Yeah, it takes on many forms at High.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in college, like discovering the escapism or the suspension of disbelief,
Mm-hmm.
highly academic terms.
Yeah.
And getting into debates with fellow students before I discovered Theater of the Oppressed or applied theater, socially engaged work in its canon, and I've come to realize in my work outside of what college provided for me that joy that you found where you all just kind of forgot about the world for a minute. For me, it's often the opposite. We are all so focused on the world, but this conversation is transcendental compared to how we usually talk about it. Mm-hmm. Like none of us are fighting, none of us are, and we're listening to each other. There's a magic in that kind of, in the theatricality that happens there in a real setting, that theater principles can create space for.
Absolutely. And I think of theater as like the playground for rebellion. You know what I mean? Like it's a safe place to ask scary questions. So yeah. I knew that when I mentioned the world melting away, you were going to take issue with it, but I don't actually mean that I forgot that we were in the world. It was that I forgot that I wasn't in their world. I forgot that we weren't all in the reality that they were creating. And so that's why when you're making theater that feels really meaningful, you have a really important story to tell. If it can feel all encompassing for the audience, that's a good thing. It's not that the audience forgets that like the human world is the human world, but it makes them feel like they are invited into a world in which they are allowed to either really like get a hard look at something that is unjust, or they're allowed to imagine a world that is not what the world that they recognize, where something that is unjust has been solved somehow, or a new solution is being put forward, and they're invited to step into that alternate reality for a moment and just live in it, right? And just witness, right? Either the supreme unfairness or the sheer potentiality. And I like, that's, to me, that's what's so transcendental is just the perfect word. And I think about the classics when I hear you talk about teaching, actually, because what you said about striving to acknowledge and respond to the chemistries and the energies in the room with this present group of students, and trying as a teacher to be present with them and not go into autopilot and not just do it the way it's been done before because that model has worked for students in the past. That idea, that premise, I think is like the future of good Shakespeare making. Like, I think that's how you have to do it. You have to approach the text like it's a new play and you're the first one who's ever done it, and you are present in a room with a group of artists and you sort of scrap the way it's been done before, and you say, all right, legacy, all right, historical baggage, all right, precedent about how this character is portrayed or performed. I acknowledge you, I respect that you're there, but we're going to set you aside because we're going to try to figure out what the story means to us and who these characters are embodied by our actors in this moment in time, and how we take what is on the page. And I think it has to be about living in the present moment, and it has to be about applying the same innovation and ingenuity that you would apply to a new play that's still in development to a text, and refusing to let the way the play has been done for however many hundreds of years get in the way of you telling the story that is going to resonate with our world as it is now.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. That's right.
So with that, we're at an hour. So unless you have any questions for me, I think I'm good. This has been fantastic. But if you have any other things you want to make sure you talk about or ask me, now is the time.
I have a habit when we talk of taking notes.
Yes, you do.
Notice.
Yes.
Of oh, that's something we could talk about. That's a topic. Oh, right. I need to tell you this. I have a question about that. Mm-hmm. Which just goes to show that you and I could talk until we're blue in the face.
Yeah.
and eventually Zoom fatigue kicks in. So really, my most pressing question is, how much time do we have?
As much time as you want.
Okay. Well, first, I want to thank the people who put this interview together.
Yes.
Both to the contributors, to the leadership team, and any volunteer that ever gives their time to the organization. We obviously can't do it without the village. Yeah. And there's no justifiable way to set aside the collective awakening around racial injustice in our country right now. That is to say, this work has been happening for years, lobbying and advocating against police reform and the war on Black people. But now, white institutions, corporations, nonprofits, theaters included, are all they're putting out statements. They're putting out content. They're asking people for advice or sometimes for approval, and we're in a really precious moment, which is stemming back to that point we made earlier, how some of us call it applied theater or theater of the oppressed, or socially engaged theater. You and I talk often about reimagining or rebelling against or through the classics.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to see the infinitely nuanced and diverse ways in which those conversations will be propelled in new kinds of theater.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I guess that's not as much of a question as much as a thank you back to the people who are working with Sweet Tea somehow or giving to Sweet Tea, because
yes,
it's no coincidence that civil unrest around the world after George Floyd's murder and the myriad and endless amount of Black people who've been dying under the hands of police power in this country. There's no coincidence that COVID and this is happening simultaneously.
Right.
It might be a controversial thing to say that one is happening because of the other. Not solely because, but our quarantine has played a part in people's willingness to finally jump in and play at least their part as a supporter, as a contributor.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to seeing more of the ways in which audiences, spectators, balance their contributions to their communities and ask for and advocate for theater that matters more, theater that gets people involved.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that is the bar to strive for, to or leap,
Yeah. Yeah, when we watch live events now, and I'm not talking like the synchronous webinars or live recorded interviews or performances, when we actually gather to be together in person, that's going to be such a precious and ephemeral delicate moment that we will not afford, and we will not be justified to waste it. So let's figure out what that's going to be.
And we have to be nimble, right? We have to be agile enough as institutions and as artists to be ready for that moment whenever it comes, because the timeline is fuzzy and the future is not known. So do the work now to prepare yourself, to prime yourself, to be ready to seize that moment when it lights.
That's right.
That's a really good reminder, and I really appreciate you saying it.
Thank you again. I guess let's call it a day.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you all for listening and for playing your part.
Yes, absolutely. Listeners, it's been a joy and an honor, and I'm gonna play us out now.